The workers did not know what they were building. Not fully. They knew they were digging. They knew they were shaping clay. They knew they were firing figures in kilns and painting them in colors that have long since faded. They knew the pits were enormous and the work was endless, and that failing in the work carried consequences that no one wanted to contemplate. What they did not know was that more than 2,000 years later, a farmer digging a well in Shanxi province would break through the soil and find a hand, a terracotta hand, and that the hand would lead to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. Thousands of warriors standing in formation underground. An entire army made of clay, each face individual, each figure armed and positioned as if waiting for an order that would never come. They did not know that the world would eventually call the man they served the first emperor. They only knew his name, Ying Zheng, and they knew enough to be afraid. Welcome, settle in, get comfortable. We are going back more than 2,000 years tonight, to a world of warring kingdoms and bronze weapons and silk roads and burning books and an ambition so vast that it reshaped the idea of what a country could be. The story of Qin Shi Huang is one of the most consequential in all of human history, and it is full of details that no popular account has ever fully captured. The China that existed before Qin Shi Huang unified, it was not one country in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of states that shared certain cultural and linguistic traditions, but that were in every practical political sense independent and frequently at war with each other. The period that historians call the Warring States period, from roughly 475 BC to 221 BC, was one of the most violent and most intellectually productive eras in Chinese history. A combination that is less paradoxical than it sounds, because crisis tends to generate both destruction and innovation simultaneously. The 7 major states that competed during the Warring States period were Qin, Ku, Qi, Yan, Han, Wei, and Zhao, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own administrative system, its own army, its own currency, and its own system of weights and measures, and each in a permanent state of competitive tension with the others, that periodically broke into open warfare and equally periodically resolved into temporary alliances that dissolved when circumstances changed. The intellectual response to this political fragmentation was one of the most extraordinary in human history. The period that corresponds roughly to the Warring States era is the period of the 100 schools of thought, when Chinese philosophy produced Confucianism and Taoism and legalism and Mohism and a dozen other systematic approaches to the fundamental questions of how people should live and how society should be organized. The specific social and political chaos of the era was the environment that generated the philosophical traditions that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2,500 years. The school of thought that would have the most immediate political consequence was legalism, a philosophical tradition associated with thinkers like Shangyang and Han Fei that argued for a specific approach to governance based on strict law, clear rewards and punishments, the subordination of individual interest to the state, and the rational reorganization of society to maximize agricultural production and military power. The legalist tradition rejected the Confucian emphasis on virtue and personal moral cultivation as the foundation of good governance, and argued instead for institutional systems that would produce correct behavior, regardless of the individual virtue or vice of the people subject to them. The state of Qin was the state that most thoroughly adopted legalist principles, and this adoption was not accidental, but the result of specific historical choices made over several generations. The reformer Shangyang, who served the Qin state in the 4th century BC, implemented a series of transformations that reorganized Qin society along the lines that legalist theory recommended. abolishing the hereditary aristocracy's exemption from punishment, reorganizing the population into administrative units that were collectively responsible for each other's behavior, creating a system of military ranks that could be earned by performance in battle, and opening new agricultural land through irrigation projects that increased the state's food production and therefore its military capacity. These reforms were painful and controversial in their implementation. Xiangyang himself was eventually executed after the death of the ruler who had supported him, his body torn apart by chariots in a form of execution that communicated clearly the depth of the opposition he had generated. But the institutional changes he had made survived his death because they had created constituencies that benefited from them, and because the state that had adopted them was demonstrably more powerful than the states that had not. By the time Yingzheng was born in 259 BC, the state of Qin was already the most powerful of the 7 warring states, not yet capable of unification but clearly moving in that direction. Its army trained and equipped and organized on principles that gave it consistent advantages over the armies of the other states. Its agricultural system producing the surplus that funded military operations. Its administrative system efficient and cruel in ways that the other states found both frightening and difficult to replicate. The circumstances of Yingzheng's birth are themselves surrounded by a story that has fascinated historians for centuries and that touches on some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of political legitimacy and dynastic succession. His father was Zi, a prince of the Qin royal family who was being held as a hostage in the state of Shao as part of the diplomatic arrangements that frequently involved sending royal children to other courts as security for political agreements. The merchant El Bue encountered Zichu in Shao and formed a specific assessment of his situation that El Bue's own later writing articulated in a phrase that has become one of the more memorable in Chinese historical literature. He called Zichu a rare commodity worth investing in. The phrase reflects the commercial mind that El Bue brought to political calculation. The assessment that a hostage prince with the right connections and the right support could become king, and that the returns on investing in that outcome would be extraordinary. El Bue proceeded to invest. He used his commercial wealth to provide Zichu with resources and connections. He introduced him to the court of Qin through intermediaries. He arranged the political maneuvering that eventually resulted in Zichu being designated as heir to the Qin throne, and he gave Zichu his own concubine, a woman named Xiao Ji, who was either already pregnant with El Bue's child when she was given to Zichu, or who became pregnant by Zichu after the gift, depending on which version of the story you read. The question of whether Yingzheng was biologically the son of Zichu or of El Bue was raised in ancient Chinese sources and has been debated ever since. The Shiji, the great historical work of Sima Qian, compiled in the 1st century BC, records the story of the pregnancy in a way that is deliberately ambiguous. And the ambiguity is itself historically significant because it suggests that the story was already in circulation and that Sima Qian found it credible enough to record while perhaps not certain enough to state definitively whether or not the story is true. Yingzheng was recognized as Zichu's son and heir. He was born in 259 BC in the city of Handan, the capital of Shao, where his father was held as hostage. And he spent his early childhood in an environment that was simultaneously that of an enemy state and that of a royal household, a combination that provided an early education in the specific insecurities of power and the specific vulnerability of anyone whose position depended entirely on the goodwill of others. Zichu eventually escaped from Shao and returned to Qin, leaving Zhao Ji and the young Yingzheng behind temporarily, and the period when the boy was in Shao without his father's protection was one of considerable danger because the political relationship between Qin and Zhao was turbulent, and the son of a Qin prince was a potential target for the hostility that generated. The experience of vulnerability and danger in childhood is one that appears repeatedly in the histories of people who became extreme in the exercise of power as adults. And the specific form of Yingzhang's childhood vulnerability, the diplomatic hostage situation that made his safety dependent on political calculations he could not control, was one of the more intense versions of that experience. Zichu died in 247 BC after reigning as king of Qin for only 3 years, and Yingzhang became king at the age of 13, with Elbue serving as regent and his mother, Shaoji, holding significant influence at court. The specific political arrangements of the regency period are documented in the sources in ways that show both the complexity of the court situation and the specific challenges that a child king faced in a state organized around legalist principles of authority and competition. Elbue accumulated enormous power during the regency years, holding the title of chancellor and the informal status of the Zhongfu, a term that can be translated as second father or uncle, but that implied a specific relationship of authority over the young king. And he managed the state with the combination of commercial acumen and political skill that had originally identified Zichu as a commodity worth investing in. The return on his investment had come, and it was substantial. The romantic and political complications of the regency period involve Shaoji, the queen mother, in ways that the sources describe with a combination of detail and condemnation that reflects both the specific events and the specific moral framework through which court historians of later eras judged the behavior of royal women. Elbue's relationship with Shaoji apparently continued after Zichu's death and became politically awkward as Yingzhang grew older. Elbue responded by introducing a man named Lao Ai into the Queen Mother's circle as a replacement, and Lao Ai and Zhao Ji became involved in a relationship that produced children and eventually in a conspiracy to prevent Yingzhang from taking full personal power when he came of age. The conspiracy was discovered and crushed in 238 BC when Yingzhang was 21 and had just completed the coming-of-age ceremony that formally established his right to rule independently. Lao Ai was executed, along with his associates and his children, with Shaoji. Shaoji was placed under house arrest, and Elbue, who was implicated in the conspiracy, or at least sufficiently associated with it to become politically untenable, was dismissed from his position and eventually died, whether by suicide, under pressure, or by other means, depending on which source you read. The crushing of the conspiracy and the removal of the regency power represented Yingzhang taking full personal control of the Qin state, and the energy and the ambition and the specific combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that he brought to that control would transform not just the state of Qin, but the entire Chinese world within the following 2 decades. The military campaigns that produced unification began in earnest in 230 BC and were completed in 221 BC, a period of 9 years in which the Qin army systematically eliminated the other 6 major states. The campaigns were conducted with a combination of military force and diplomatic calculation that Qin's legalist administrative system had made possible. The military was well organized and well supplied. The commanders were selected for competence rather than birth, and the strategic approach combined overwhelming force where necessary with negotiation and subversion where those were more efficient. The state of Han fell first in 230 BC, the weakest of the 7, and the one that had been most thoroughly weakened by decades of Qin pressure. Its territory was absorbed into the Qin administrative system, and its people became subjects of Qin rather than citizens of a separate state. The absorption was real and permanent in a way that the territorial exchanges and tributary relationships of earlier Chinese politics had not been. Qin was not creating a sphere of influence or extracting tribute. It was eliminating independent political entities and replacing them with administrative units of a unified state. Shao fell in 228 BC after a series of campaigns that included some of the most intense fighting of the unification wars. Shao had been one of the most militarily capable of the warring states, and its resistance was correspondingly difficult to overcome. The eventual fall of Handan, the Shao capital, where Yingzheng had spent his early childhood, must have carried specific personal resonance for the man who had been a vulnerable child in that city, and who was now the conqueror of it. Wei fell in 225 BC, Ku in 223 BC after a campaign that required the deployment of 600,000 soldiers and the leadership of the general Wang Jian, who had insisted on this scale of force. After a first attempt with fewer troops had failed, Yan fell in 222 BC, and Qi, the last of the 7 states and one that had been pursuing a policy of accommodation with Qin that delayed rather than prevented its absorption, fell in 221 BC. In 221 BC, Yingzheng held a court conference to determine what title was appropriate for the ruler of a unified China. The existing titles, the title of king that the rulers of the warring states had used, seemed insufficient for the scale of what had been accomplished. The advisors proposed the title Huangdi, a term that combined 2 older words for august divine ruler, and that was associated in Chinese cosmological tradition with the legendary sage emperors of the mythological past. Yingzheng accepted the title but added a prefix. He called himself Qin Shi Huang, the first august emperor of Qin, and he decreed that his successors would be the second emperor, the third emperor, and so on for 10,000 generations. The 10,000 generations did not materialize. The Qin dynasty lasted 15 years after unification, but the title he created, Huangdi, the emperor, became the title that every ruler of a unified China would use for the next 2,000 years, until the last emperor of the Qing dynasty abdicated in 1912. Every person who ruled a united China used a version of the title that Yingzheng had invented for himself in 221 BC. The administrative transformation that followed unification was as radical as the military conquest that preceded it. The first emperor and his chief minister, Li Si, implemented a series of standardizations that attempted to create a genuinely unified state from the 7 different administrative, legal, and cultural systems that had coexisted during the warring states period. The standardization of weights and measures was one of the most practically important of these reforms. The 7 states had used different systems for measuring weight, volume, and length, and commerce across state boundaries had required constant conversion and created endless opportunities for fraud and confusion. The Qin standardization established uniform measures across the entire empire and enforced them through legal penalties for non-compliance. Merchants who had done business across state lines immediately understood the practical benefits, even if they would have preferred to continue using the measures they knew. The standardization of currency was equally important. The various states had issued different forms of money, coins of different shapes and denominations and metals, and trade across the former state boundaries had required currency exchange with all the friction and cost that implied. The Qin standardization established 2 forms of currency: gold for large transactions and a round copper coin with a square hole in the center, the Banliang coin, for everyday commerce. This specific form, the round coin with the square hole, would remain the standard form of Chinese currency for the next 2,000 years. The standardization of writing is perhaps the most culturally significant of the Qin reforms. The various states had developed different versions of Chinese characters over the centuries, variants that were often recognizable as related, but that differed enough in specific forms that literacy in one state's script did not guarantee the ability to read another's. Li Si oversaw the creation of a standardized script, the small seal script that was imposed across the empire. And this standardization of the writing system was one of the foundations of the cultural unity of China that has persisted even through periods of political fragmentation. The specific importance of this writing standardization for Chinese history cannot be overstated, because Chinese is a written language in which the characters represent words rather than sounds, in the way that alphabetic writing does. A standardized writing system provides a form of cultural unity that is independent of spoken language differences. People in different parts of China who could not understand each other's spoken dialects could still communicate through the written characters that the Qin reform had standardized. And this capacity for written communication across dialect difference has been one of the foundations of Chinese cultural unity through the millennia. Since the standardization of the axle width of carts and chariots is one of those reforms that seems almost too mundane to mention, but that had real practical consequences for the kind of state that the first emperor was trying to create. The different states had used different axle widths, and the roads that carts had worn grooves in over centuries were calibrated to specific widths that did not match those of other states. A unified standard axle width meant that vehicles could move across the entire empire on roads whose grooves matched their wheels, facilitating the movement of goods, armies, and administrative communications in ways that the physical infrastructure made possible. The road system that the first emperor built across the unified empire was itself one of the more remarkable infrastructure achievements of the ancient world. Roads radiating from the capital Shenyang to every part of the empire, built to standard widths, shaded by trees planted at regular intervals, maintained by a system of administrative responsibility that made local officials accountable for the condition of the roads in their territories. The system was designed primarily for military movement and administrative communication, but it served commercial and cultural purposes as well, connecting the different regions of the empire in ways that the fragmented warring states period had not permitted. The capital at Shenyang, which the first emperor built into one of the grandest cities in the ancient world, was itself a monument to the ambitions of the unification project. He brought artisans and artists and craftsmen from every conquered state to work on its construction. He built palaces that replicated the palaces of the conquered kings as a form of symbolic incorporation, and he undertook construction projects of a scale that required the organized labor of hundreds of thousands of people. The specific logistics of feeding and managing these workforces were themselves an administrative achievement that the centralized legalist state made possible in ways that the decentralized warring states system could not have managed. The Great Wall that the first emperor is most commonly associated with in popular imagination was not built from nothing, but was the consolidation and connection of existing walls that the individual warring states had built along their northern borders to defend against the steppe peoples to the north, the Jiannu and other nomadic confederacies that had been a persistent pressure on the settled agricultural civilizations of northern China throughout the warring states period. The Qin consolidation connected these existing walls and extended them along the most vulnerable sections of the northern frontier, creating something closer to a continuous barrier than had existed before. The construction of the wall required the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them convicts and conscripted peasants, working in conditions that the sources describe as extremely harsh. Deaths in large numbers, inadequate food and clothing, working in terrain that was remote and difficult. The human cost of the Great Wall construction is one of the dark chapters of the reign that Chinese popular tradition has preserved in stories about the wall being built on the bones of the workers who died constructing it. The specific general who commanded the northern frontier and the wall construction was Meng Tian, one of the most capable commanders in the Qin military, who held the northern frontier with a large army and extended the road system north to connect the capital with the frontier fortifications. Meng Tian's career and eventual fate are one of the threads that connect the military achievements of the first emperor's reign to the political crisis that followed his death. The burning of the books in 213 BC is one of the most infamous episodes of the reign, and one that requires some care to understand accurately rather than simply. The specific event was a decree issued by the first emperor on the recommendation of Li Si, ordering the burning of books held by private individuals, with specific exemptions for books on practical subjects like agriculture, divination, and medicine, and for the books held in the imperial library. The target of the burning was specifically the philosophical and historical literature of the various states, the texts of the Confucian school and other schools that discussed alternative models of governance, and that could be used to criticize the Qin system by comparing it unfavorably to the ways things had been done in the past or to the philosophical ideal of what governance should be. Li Si's argument, which is preserved in the sources, was that private individuals who used historical knowledge to criticize the present were a source of political instability, and that the knowledge they were drawing on should therefore be suppressed. The historical reality of the book burning is complicated by several factors. The exemption of the imperial library meant that texts that survived in official copies could eventually be recovered, and there is significant evidence that texts survived the burning in private hands through various forms of concealment. The scale of the loss of texts from the Warring States period is real, but it is not as total as the image of the burning of all books suggests, and the subsequent burning and destruction associated with the fall of the Qin dynasty and the civil wars that followed it may have destroyed more texts than the official burning of 213 BC. The burial alive of scholars in 212 BC is another episode that requires careful attention to what the sources actually say, as opposed to what the popular tradition has made of it. The traditional account describes the burial alive of 460 Confucian scholars, but more recent and careful reading of the sources suggests that the people who were killed were primarily not Confucian scholars engaged in philosophical debate, but practitioners of the alchemical and magical arts who had been working on projects related to immortality and who had angered the emperor by their failure to produce results and by their subsequent criticism and flight. The Immortality project is one of the more psychologically revealing aspects of the first emperor's later years. He became increasingly obsessed with the search for immortality, or at minimum, for extreme longevity, and he sponsored expeditions to find the mythological islands of the immortals and the elixirs that could confer eternal life. One of these expeditions, led by a man named Su Fu, purportedly took 3,000 young men and women to sea in search of the islands and never returned. Whether the expedition was lost at sea, or whether Su Fu decided that returning to the increasingly unpredictable emperor was not worth the risk of failure, is something the sources leave ambiguous. The pills of mercury and other substances that court alchemists prepared as immortality treatments for the first emperor were almost certainly contributing to his deteriorating health. In the later years of the reign, mercury poisoning produces specific neurological symptoms that may partly explain the increasing erratic quality of the decision-making in the final years. The irony that the search for immortality was accelerating his death is one that the tradition has noted with the satisfaction that such ironies tend to generate. The inspection tours of the empire that the first emperor conducted were another characteristic feature of the reign. He traveled to the various parts of the empire to make the imperial presence visible and to perform the ritual ceremonies that connected the emperor to the territories he governed. These tours were documented in inscriptions on stone steles erected at significant locations across the empire, and several of these inscriptions survive. They are among the most direct physical records of how the first emperor understood himself and his achievement. The inscriptions describe the unification in terms that emphasize the restoration of order after chaos, the creation of legality and civilization out of the disorder of the warring states period, the emperor as the source of all benefit to the people, the specific achievements of standardization and road building, and the enforcement of consistent law across the empire. The language is formal and formulaic in the way that inscriptions designed for public display always are, but it gives a specific window into the official ideology of the reign and into the specific claims that the Qin state was making about what it had accomplished and why it was legitimate. The assassination attempts against the first emperor are another dimension of the story that the popular accounts tend to reduce to simple drama without fully exploring their historical significance. There were several attempts, the most famous involving a musician named Gao Jianli, who concealed lead weights in his lute and attempted to strike the emperor with it during a performance, and a failed assassination organized by the state of Yan involving a man named Jing Qi, who was sent with a map of Yan's territory as an apparently diplomatic gift, with a dagger concealed in the scroll of the map. The attempt failed because Jing Qi was unable to complete the kill and was cut down by the emperor's guards. The fact that there were multiple serious assassination attempts against the first emperor is evidence of the depth of the opposition. His rule generated, even after unification, people from the conquered states who found the Qin system oppressive and who were willing to risk and ultimately lose their lives to resist it. The assassins were not acting from political nihilism, but from a specific understanding of what had been lost in the unification and what the Qin system was doing to the societies it had absorbed. The death of the first emperor occurred in 210 BC during one of his inspection tours at a place called Shakyu in what is now Hebei province. He was 49 years old. He had reigned as king of Qin for 25 years and as emperor for 11, and he died in circumstances that generated immediate conspiracy because no clear succession had been publicly announced. The chief eunuch Xiao Gao and the chief minister Li Si decided to conceal the emperor's death. They kept the imperial cortege moving as if the emperor were still alive. They continued to bring food to the carriage in which his body was traveling, and they managed the communications of the tour to prevent the news from reaching the capital or the army before they were ready. The specific detail that summer heat was causing the body to decompose, and that they arranged for a cart of salted fish to travel with the cortege to mask the smell is one of those historical details that is simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. The smell of rotting empire managed with salted fish. The succession they arranged elevated Huhai, the 18th son of the first emperor, to the throne as the second emperor, passing over the eldest son Fusu, who was with the army on the northern frontier under the command of Meng Tian, and who would have been the natural and expected heir. They sent a forged decree in the first emperor's name ordering Fusu to commit suicide, and Fusu, believing the decree was genuine, complied. Meng Tian also died in the aftermath of the succession. The second emperor's reign was a catastrophe in almost every dimension. Xiaogo accumulated power at the expense of both Li Si, who was eventually executed on trumped-up charges, and of the second emperor himself, who became increasingly isolated and controlled. The harsh Qin system of law and forced labor was continued, and in some respects intensified at precisely the moment when the new empire needed consolidation and accommodation, and the result was widespread rebellion that the Qin military system, which had been designed for conquest rather than for internal pacification at scale, could not manage effectively. The rebellion that most directly ended the Qin dynasty began among a group of conscripted laborers led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, who were being transported to a posting on the frontier and who, delayed by floods and facing execution for the lateness that the floods had caused, decided that the risk of rebellion was preferable to the certainty of execution under Qin law. Their initial success inspired wider rebellions, and the political entrepreneurs who saw in the chaos an opportunity to restore the kingdoms that Qin had abolished. Among these entrepreneurs were Liu Bang, a minor official of common origin who would eventually found the Han dynasty, and Shang Yu, the heir of a noble family from the former state of Kutch, whose military ability was extraordinary. The rivalry between these two men and the forces they commanded in the chaos following the Qin collapse is one of the great stories of Chinese history, and it lies beyond the boundaries of the first emperor's own story. But it is the direct consequence of the specific failures of the regime he had built. The Qin dynasty officially fell in 206 BC, 15 years after the unification. When the last Qin king surrendered to Liu Bang's forces, the palaces at Shanyang were burned, the imperial library was looted or destroyed, and the physical monuments of the unified empire were largely dismantled or damaged in the violence of the collapse. What survived was not the institutions or the palaces, but the precedents, the idea of a unified Chinese state, the administrative frameworks that subsequent dynasties would adapt and refine, the standardized writing system that the Han dynasty would maintain and develop, the concept of the emperor as the ruler of all under heaven. These survived the fall of the Qin and shaped every subsequent Chinese dynasty. The Han dynasty that replaced Qin modified the harshest aspects of legalist governance while maintaining the institutional framework of unified imperial rule. The combination of Confucian ideology and legalist administrative practice that the Balint developed became the template for Chinese governance that would persist through the imperial period. And this template rested on the foundation that Qin Shi Huang had laid. The specific physical monument, the Terracotta Army that was buried with him in his mausoleum complex, was discovered in 1974 when farmers drilling a well found the first fragments. The subsequent excavation revealed 3 main pits containing approximately 8,000 terracotta figures, soldiers, horses, chariots, and officials, arranged in military formation as if ready to guard or serve the emperor in the afterlife. The scale of the Terracotta Army is one of those things that statistics can convey in numbers, but that requires physical presence to fully appreciate. 8,000 individual figures, each one life-size, each one with individually modeled facial features that differ from figure to figure, arranged in a pit that covers an area of several thousand square meters. This was not a simple funerary offering, but a recreation of an army, an attempt to bring into the afterlife the specific military force that had achieved the unification. The construction of the mausoleum complex was one of the largest construction projects in the ancient world. According to the Shiji, It involved 700,000 workers over decades, beginning when Yingzheng first became king of Qin at 13 and continuing through the unification and until his death. The central burial mound, which has never been fully excavated, is estimated to contain the burial chamber that ancient sources describe as containing a model of the empire, with rivers of mercury flowing through it, representing the actual rivers of China. The crossbow traps that the sources describe as having been set to kill any intruder. The bronze coffin in which the emperor's remains were placed. The mercury rivers described in the ancient sources were dismissed for years as legend or exaggeration, but modern geochemical surveys of the burial mound have detected elevated mercury levels in the soil consistent with the presence of significant quantities of liquid mercury underground, which is one of those moments when the ancient record and the scientific analysis converge in a way that is genuinely astonishing. The account in the Shiji may have been accurate. The people who built the Terracotta Army, the craftsmen who shaped and fired and painted the figures, remain largely anonymous, though their workshop marks are visible on some of the figures. They worked in a system of quality control that marked each figure with the name of the workshop that produced it, a form of administrative accountability that is consistent with the broader Qin approach to governance through systems of responsibility and record-keeping rather than through personal virtue or trust. The individual faces of the terracotta warriors are one of the details that reward extended attention. The ancient sources say that they were modeled on actual soldiers, which the modern research on the range of facial types represented in the figures seems to be consistent with. The faces include a range of features that suggests representation of the diverse population of the Qin armies. Soldiers from the various former states, and possibly from the frontier territories. The diversity of faces in an army assembled from across the Chinese world. The colors that originally covered the terracotta figures, which the excavation has revealed in fragments and traces, show that these were not the gray terracotta figures familiar from museum displays, but painted figures with vivid pigments representing the varied uniforms and equipment of the Qin army. The rapid oxidation that destroys the paint when the figures are exposed to air means that the Terracotta Army that excavation has revealed is a monochrome ghost of the original chromatic reality. An army that was in its original form a spectacular and vivid representation of military power painted in colors that the earth has absorbed over to millennia. The excavation of the Terracotta Army is still ongoing. Archaeologists estimate that a significant portion of the pits has not yet been fully excavated, and the techniques available for excavation have improved significantly since 1974. The most recent work has used increasingly sophisticated methods for stabilizing the pigments that survive in the unexcavated sections, giving some hope that future excavation will reveal more of the original colors than the earlier work was able to preserve. The burial mound itself remains unexcavated. The decision to delay the opening of the central burial chamber has been made by the Chinese archaeological authorities on the grounds that the current technology for preserving organic materials and for managing the specific conditions inside the chamber is not yet adequate to prevent the destruction of the contents that opening would risk. The mercury that geochemical surveys have detected suggests conditions inside the chamber that are genuinely unusual and that would pose specific challenges for preservation. The patience required to wait for better technology before opening one of the great unexcavated archaeological sites in the world is remarkable, and the decision to exercise it is one that the contents of the chamber, if they survive, will eventually vindicate. The historians who have written about Qin Shi Huang have approached him from various perspectives that reflect both the genuine complexity of his historical record and the specific ideological frameworks within which Chinese and Western historical traditions have understood him. The Confucian tradition that dominated Chinese historical writing for most of the imperial period was consistently hostile, viewing the burning of books and the rejection of Confucian principles of governance as central crimes that the achievements of unification did not excuse. The 20th century produced a specific episode of Qin Shi Huang rehabilitation in China that is historically interesting in its own right. Mao Zedong, who led the communist revolution that established the People's Republic of China in 1949, found in Qin Shi Huang a useful predecessor, a ruler who had unified China through force, who had rejected the intellectual traditions of the educated elite, who had used state power to transform society according to a specific rational system rather than being bound by custom and precedent. The parallel was not subtle, and Mao made it explicit on several occasions, claiming to have exceeded Qin Shi Huang in the scale of his book burning by referring to the campaigns against intellectuals during the Cultural Revolution. The use of Qin Shi Huang as a political symbol in 20th century China is itself evidence of the continuing relevance of his story too. Questions about how China should be governed and what relationship between the state and individual freedom is appropriate for a unified Chinese civilization. These are not questions with settled answers, and the first emperor stands at their origin in Chinese history. The specific legacy that is most present in the contemporary world is the territorial concept of a unified China that Qin Shi Huang established. The idea that the territories within which the various warring states operated constituted a natural unit that ought to be governed as a single state has been one of the most persistent and most politically potent ideas in Chinese history. Dynasties that unified these territories were understood as legitimate by that fact. Dynasties that failed to hold them together were understood as in some sense incomplete, and the aspiration to reunification was always present in periods of fragmentation as the natural goal of political development. The specific boundaries of the territory that Qin Shi Huang unified have changed over the 2 millennia since his death. China, as currently constituted, includes territories that were not part of the Qin Empire and does not include some territories that were. But the core concept of a unified Chinese state governing the heartland of the Chinese civilization is one that the first emperor established and that his successors in every dynasty have drawn on. The legacy is real and it is enormous. The writing system, the administrative concepts, the imperial title, the territorial idea, the road infrastructure and the canal infrastructure and the wall infrastructure that the Qin built and that subsequent dynasties maintained and extended. All of these are part of what Qin Shi Huang left behind. They outlasted the dynasty by 2,000 years, and some of them are present in the contemporary world in forms that are still recognizably connected to their origin. The man who created all of this was, by any assessment, a person of extraordinary ability and extraordinary ruthlessness, who governed through a system that made enormous demands on the people it governed, and that was maintained through violence and surveillance and collective punishment in ways that were genuinely oppressive by any standard. Who built things that will outlast almost everything else built in his era or since, and who died at 49 searching for immortality and finding instead the most famous tomb in Asia. He was afraid of death in the way that people who have accumulated everything are afraid of death. Afraid because there was so much to lose. afraid because the thing he had built was not designed to survive without him, and he knew it. Afraid perhaps because the people who had suffered for his ambition would be waiting on the other side of whatever door death opened. The tomb was the answer to this fear that his civilization provided. Bring everything with you. Bring the army that conquered the world. Bring the model of the empire with its mercury rivers. Bring the capacity to continue in death what had been accomplished in life. The terracotta figures standing in formation underground for 2,000 years are the most literal possible expression of a refusal to accept that death ends things. Death ended things anyway. The dynasty fell 15 years after he died. The palaces burned, the empire fragmented, and the warriors stood in the dark underground waiting for an order that did not come for 2,000 years, until a farmer's well broke through and the hand appeared in the soil, and the world discovered what had been waiting there all along. The hand of an army built for an emperor who wanted to live forever, and the army that is still being excavated, that still holds its secrets in the unexcavated sections of the pits, that still stands in formation in the earth of Shanxi province, is the most extraordinary monument in the world to the specific human conviction that enough ambition and enough labor and enough organized violence can hold the future against its will. It cannot, but the attempt is magnificent. If this story has given you something to think about, if you found yourself surprised by what you did not know about the man who created the very idea of China as a unified state, tell us in the comments what stayed with you. Share this with someone who loves ancient history, and subscribe because the stories in these gaps are always worth finding. The Terracotta Army is standing in the dark beneath the earth of Shanxi. The mercury rivers may still be flowing in the burial chamber that no one has yet opened, and the light of 2,000 years of history is still falling on the face of a farmer who broke through the soil in 1974 and found a hand and did not yet know what it meant. The physical landscape of the territory that would become the Qin Empire is itself a story worth telling, because the geography determined so much of the political and military history. The region that was the heartland of the Qin state, the Wei River Valley in what is now Shanxi province, was a naturally defensible basin surrounded by mountains and rivers that gave it strategic advantages over the other warring states. Access to the Guanzhong Plain through specific mountain passes that could be defended by small forces against large ones, an agricultural land of sufficient productivity to support the population and the army that the legalist reforms had organized and motivated. The Yellow River, the great river of northern China that the Chinese have called the Mother River, formed part of the natural boundary of the Qin heartland and was both a barrier and a pathway, a resource and a danger. The flooding of the Yellow River that periodically devastated the agricultural communities along its banks was one of the recurrent crises of Chinese governance and the management of the river through irrigation and flood control projects was one of the central administrative responsibilities of every Chinese state. The Zhenghua Canal, built during the reign of Ying, Zheng's predecessor, on the advice of a hydraulic engineer from the state of Han named Zheng Guo, was one of the most important infrastructure projects of the pre-unification period. It irrigated a large area of relatively arid land in the Guanzhong Plain and dramatically increased the agricultural productivity of the Qin heartland. The Han had sent Zhengguo to Qin specifically to keep Qin occupied with a major construction project rather than with military expansion. The plan was that the canal would exhaust Qin's resources and delay its expansion. The outcome was exactly the opposite. The canal increased Qin's agricultural surplus, and therefore its military capacity, and accelerated the unification rather than delaying it. The specific technology of irrigation in the ancient Chinese world was sophisticated by any standard. The engineers who designed and built the canal systems and the flood control works were specialists with accumulated practical knowledge about hydraulics and soil and climate that had been developed over centuries of necessity. The management of water was one of the most important technical skills in ancient Chinese civilization, and the people who possessed it were among the most valuable administrators that any state could command. The climate of the Warring States period was somewhat different from the climate of the same regions today. The ancient Chinese texts describe a somewhat wetter and more forested landscape in the north than exists now. The deforestation and soil erosion that would gradually transform the low S plateau of Shanxi and Gansu were processes that began in this period and accelerated over subsequent centuries of intensive agriculture. The specific environment in which the Qin state developed was one of greater natural resources and greater agricultural potential than the same region would have today. The forests that covered significant portions of the landscape in the Warring States period were themselves resources that the competing states exploited for building materials and for charcoal, for bronze smelting and ironworking. The specific technologies of bronze casting and ironworking were central to military capacity in this period, and the access to, or deposits and fuel, was one of the competitive advantages that different states could exploit or were denied. The transition from bronze to iron weapons that was occurring during the Warring States period is one of the technological shifts that shaped the military history of the era in ways that the political accounts of battles and campaigns do not always make explicit. Iron weapons were harder to make than bronze weapons, but the ore was more widely available, and the finished product was stronger and held an edge better. The states that successfully adopted iron weapons technology had specific advantages over those that did not, and the Qin state was among the most advanced in iron weapons production. The crossbow was another military technology that was important in the Warring States period and that the Qin military used effectively. The crossbow could be used by soldiers without the years of training required for the compound bow that horsemen used. It could be produced in standardized components that could be assembled and maintained by soldiers rather than specialist craftsmen, and it could be deployed in coordinated volleys by infantry. Units that did not require the kind of individual skill development that archery on horseback required. The Terracotta Army includes crossbow soldiers, and the excavation has found actual crossbow mechanisms in the pits that demonstrate the sophistication of the Qin crossbow technology. The infantry tactics that the Qin military developed and refined over the period of the Warring States are documented in Chinese military texts of the period, including the famous works attributed to Sun Tzu and to other military theorists. The Chinese tradition of military thought that these texts represent is one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, and it reflects the specific conditions of warfare in the Warring States period. Large armies, varied terrain, the importance of logistics and supply, the role of intelligence and deception alongside direct military force, the specific tactics that the Qin military used in the unification campaigns combine the overwhelming force that Qin's demographic and economic advantages made available with the sophisticated use of terrain and timing that the Chinese military tradition emphasized. The campaigns were not simply overwhelming force applied without thought, carefully planned operations that exploited specific vulnerabilities in the states they targeted and that used political and diplomatic means alongside military ones to weaken resistance before the main force was committed. The surrender terms that the Qin offered and the treatment of conquered populations were calculated elements of the military strategy rather than afterthoughts. Conquered states that surrendered without prolonged resistance generally experienced less harsh treatment than those that fought to the end, and the calculation that surrender was preferable to continued resistance was one that the Qin military made possible by demonstrating the futility of resistance while making the terms of surrender tolerable. The administrators who followed the Qin armies into conquered territories and established the new administrative framework were as important as the soldiers in making the unification real. The military victory established physical control, but the administrative system established the practical reality of Qin governance for the populations that were now subjects rather than citizens of independent states. These administrators came from the Qin system, trained in legalist principles of governance, and they implemented those principles in territories that had been organized very differently. The resistance that the legalist administrative system generated among the populations of the conquered states was real and is documented in the sources that describe the conditions that eventually produced the rebellions that ended the Qin dynasty. The specific grievances that drove the rebellion that Chen Sheng and Wu Guang led in 209 BC, the year after the first emperor's death, were specific to the Qin administrative system. The strict application of legal penalties, the extensive use of forced labor for state construction projects, the burden of taxation and military service that the unified state imposed. All of these were experienced by people who had been accustomed to different systems as specifically Qin impositions rather than simply as the normal costs of living in a political community. The speed with which the rebellions spread after the initial uprising in 209 BC reflected the depth of the resentment that had accumulated during the 11 years of unified Qin rule. People across the former states who had been waiting for an opportunity to resist responded to the initial rebellion with a rapidity that suggests the resentment was widespread and that the restraint that had prevented earlier resistance was primarily the calculation that resistance was futile against the Qin military rather than genuine acceptance of the new order. The specific political entrepreneurs who emerged from the chaos of the rebellion and who eventually competed for control of the unified territory were people who understood that unification was not reversible in the sense of restoring the old order of independent warring states. The question they were competing to answer was not whether there would be a unified China, but which dynasty would govern it. And the answer they eventually produced, the Han dynasty founded by Liu Bang, was one that maintained the institutional framework that Qin had created while modifying the harshness of its implementation in ways that made the system more sustainable. The Han synthesis, Confucian in its ideology and legalist in its administrative practice, was the specific formula that made the unified Chinese state politically viable over the long term. And it was a synthesis that was made necessary by the specific failure of the purely legalist Qin system to maintain popular legitimacy. The lesson that the Qin collapse taught was not that unification was wrong, but that unified governance required a different kind of legitimating ideology than pure coercive legalism could provide. The Confucian scholars who had survived the book burning and the persecution of 213 to 212 BC and who emerged after the fall of Qin to play a central role in the intellectual and administrative life of the Han dynasty, were not simply restoring what had been before. They were adapting the Confucian tradition to the reality of a unified empire in ways that the pre-unification Confucian thought had not fully anticipated. The Han Confucianism that became the official ideology of the empire was a synthesis that incorporated elements of the legalist administrative framework within a Confucian ethical justification, a form of institutional pragmatism that the purely philosophical Confucian tradition of the Warring States period had not developed. The specific texts that the Han scholars recovered and reconstructed after the Qin burning are themselves a fascinating study in how historical memory works and how intellectual traditions survive attempts to suppress them. Some texts had survived in official copies that the Qin Imperial Library had held, and that came through the fall of the dynasty in varying states of completeness. Some had been memorized by scholars who had hidden from the persecution and who were able to recite texts from memory that could then be written down. Some had been hidden in walls and other concealed locations and were recovered physically, and some were reconstructed from partial copies and from the recollections of multiple scholars, whose versions could be compared and combined. The specific versions of classical texts that circulated in the Han period and that became authoritative were therefore composites of surviving materials and reconstructed memories, and in some cases probably creative reconstruction that drew on multiple partial sources and on the scholarly judgment of the people doing the reconstruction. The authenticity questions that Chinese textual scholars have debated about specific classical texts for 2,000 years are in large part the legacy of the Qin burning and the Han recovery. The uncertainty about which parts of which texts are genuinely pre-Qin and which parts are Han reconstruction is, in some cases, unresolvable with the evidence available. The oracle bones of the Shang dynasty, the ancient divination records that are the earliest surviving examples of Chinese writing and that predate Qin Shi Huang by more than 1,000 years, were being produced in a world that the first emperor's unification would eventually incorporate and transform. The oracle bone tradition itself ended with the Shang dynasty and the Bronze Age. Ritual culture it represented was already long past by the time Yingzheng was born. But the writing system that the oracle bones represent is the direct ancestor of the Chinese characters that the Qin standardization formalized and that are still in use today in modified form. This continuity of writing across more than 3,000 years is one of the most remarkable features of Chinese civilization and one that is difficult to appreciate fully without understanding how unusual it is in world history. the Chinese characters used in modern newspapers and text messages are the distant descendants of the marks carved on ox bones and turtle shells by Shang dynasty, diviners asking their ancestors for guidance about whether to go to war or when to plant crops. The specific connection runs through the Qin standardization that Qin Shi Huang imposed and that has shaped the writing system ever since. The Silk Road that would eventually connect China to the Mediterranean world was not yet in its fully developed form during the first emperor's reign. The term itself is a 19th century coinage, but the long-distance trade routes that would develop into the Silk Road were already in their earliest stages, and the political unification that Qin Shi Huang achieved made the Chinese end of the future trade network more stable and more accessible than the fragmented warring states system had permitted. The specific goods that moved along the Proto-Silk Road in the late 3rd century BC were primarily the luxury goods that different civilizations produced and that the others found desirable. Silk from China and horses from the steppe peoples, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and bronze objects from various sources. The specific items varied by route and period, but the general pattern of long-distance exchange connecting distant civilizations through a chain of intermediaries was already operating. In the period of the first emperor's reign, the Xiongnu Confederacy that the Great Wall was designed to manage were themselves participants in the steppe economy that connected China to the Western steppe and eventually to the Parthian and Roman worlds. They were not simply raiders, but traders and intermediaries, as well as military threats. And the specific relationship between the Qin state and the Xiongnu was more complex than the defensive wall metaphor suggests. The wall was one element of a relationship that also included tribute arrangements and diplomatic marriages and occasional military confrontation. The horses that the Xiongnu bred and that the Chinese found superior to their own domestically bred horses were one of the specific resources that made the steppe peoples militarily formidable and economically valuable simultaneously. The Chinese desire for high-quality horses for their cavalry was a persistent factor in the diplomatic and commercial relationships between the Han dynasty and the steppe peoples, and it was already present in its early form during the period of the Qin unification. The cavalry that the Qin army used in its northern campaigns was equipped with horses that came at least partly from the steppe trade. The lives of the artisans and craftsmen who built the Terracotta Army and the other monuments of the first emperor's reign are recoverable in fragments through the marks they left on their work and through the broader understanding of craft organization in the period. The kill marks and workshop marks that identify the units responsible for specific figures are administrative records that reflect the Qin system of collective responsibility and record-keeping. The craftsmen worked in organized units that were collectively accountable for the quality of their output, and the records of that accountability are preserved in the clay. The specific technique of constructing the terracotta figures involved a combination of mold making and hand finishing that allowed the production of figures at the scale and speed that the mausoleum project required, while maintaining the individualized quality that makes the figures remarkable. The basic body forms were made from molds, but the heads and the surface details were individually worked by hand. And the combination of systematic mold production and individual hand finishing is itself a form of the organized craftwork that the plus legalist administrative system was designed to enable. The painters who applied the colors to the finished figures were working in a tradition of decorative and representational art that had been developing in China for centuries before the unification, and that the Qin state had access to through its conquest of the other states with their own artistic traditions. The specific pigments used, lacquer and mineral pigments, and organic colorants, were the standard materials of the Chinese craft tradition, and they created the vivid appearance that the figures had before exposure to air began destroying the paint. The scale of the organizational achievement that the Mausoleum project represents deserves emphasis, because it is easy to look at the individual figures and appreciate their aesthetic quality without fully grasping what it meant to create 8,000 of them and thousands of additional figures and objects in the other pits within the time frame that the project required. The organization of the labor, the supply of the materials, the coordination of different craft specialists, the management of quality across thousands of individually worked objects. All of this was a demonstration of the administrative capacity of the Qin state that in some ways equals the more dramatic demonstrations on the battlefield. The first emperor who walked through the palaces of Xianyang and received the reports of his administrators and planned his inspection tours and worried about immortality was also the person responsible for this organizational achievement. And the connection between the administrative mind that could organize the construction of the Terracotta Army and the administrative mind that could organize the conquest of 6 states and the standardization of weights and measures and writing across a vast empire is not a coincidence, but a reflection of the same specific quality of intelligence applied to different domains. The fear of death that drove the search for immortality was also connected to the administrative impulse that drove the standardization projects and the mausoleum construction. They are all expressions of the same desire to impose control, to make the world conform to a specific vision rather than to accept what circumstance provides. The Immortality project failed in the specific sense that the first emperor died at 49 and is buried under an unexcavated mound in Shanxi province. But the administrative projects succeeded in the specific sense that the China we know today is still organized around frameworks that the Qin dynasty created. The county system of local administration that the Qin established, and that the Han maintained, and that has continued in modified form through every subsequent Chinese dynasty to the present, is one of the most durable institutional creations in human history. The specific idea that the territory of China should be divided into administrative units governed by appointed officials rather than hereditary lords has been the basis of Chinese local governance for more than 2,000 years. The officials change, the boundaries shift, the titles evolve, but the basic institutional concept that Qin Shi Huang implemented has endured. The written law code that the Qin established, fragments of which have been recovered in archaeological discoveries of Qin period bamboo strips that preserve specific legal texts, was another institutional innovation whose principle outlasted the specific content. The idea that governance should proceed through written law rather than through the personal judgment of rulers and officials is one that the legalist tradition championed, and that the Qin implementation embedded in the administrative practice of the Chinese state. Subsequent dynasties modified the specific content of the law, but maintained the principle of governance through written legal codes. The examination system that the Han eventually developed for selecting officials, which would become the formal civil service examination system that shaped Chinese governance through the imperial period, was not a Qin invention, but it grew from the Qin principle that official positions should be filled based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary right. The meritocratic principle that the legalists championed and that the Qin partially implemented was the ancestor of the examination system that the later tradition developed. All of this institutional legacy is present in the world in ways that are visible to those who know where to look. And knowing where to look requires knowing the story that we have been following tonight. The story of a boy who was born in a hostage situation and who became the king of the most powerful state in China, and who organized the conquest of 6 states and the unification of the Chinese world, and who standardized the writing and the currency and the weights and measures, and who built walls and roads and canals, and who burned books and killed scholars and searched for immortality, and who built the greatest tomb in Asia, and who died at 49, having transformed the world more thoroughly than almost anyone who had come before him. The terracotta warriors are still standing in the dark. The unexcavated sections still hold their secrets, and the China that exists today, with its unified government and its standardized writing and its concept of itself as a single civilization with a continuous history, is, in some traceable ways, the descendant of the ambition and the ruthlessness and the extraordinary organizational capacity of the man who wanted to rule for 10,000 generations and whose dynasty lasted 15 years. He did not get 10,000 generations. He got something more durable. He got the idea, and the idea is still here. If the story of the first emperor has given you something to think about, if there were details you had never encountered before, or connections you had not previously made, leave a comment. Share this with someone who loves ancient history. And subscribe, because the stories we find in these places are always worth the time. The earth of Shanxi is keeping its secrets a little longer, and the army is waiting, as it has been waiting for more than 2,000 years. The philosophical world of ancient China in the century before the first emperor was as rich and as contested as any intellectual environment in human history. And understanding it adds texture to the story of what the unification meant and what was lost and gained when one system prevailed over the others. Confucius had lived and taught in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, more than 200 years before Qin Shi Huang, and the tradition his teaching had generated was one of the dominant intellectual forces of the Warring States period. But Confucianism in the Warring States period was not yet the single authoritative tradition it would become under the Han. It was one school among many, competing with Taoism and legalism and Mohism and naturalism and various other traditions for the attention of the rulers who employed scholars and the students who sought learning. The Confucian tradition emphasized the cultivation of personal virtue, the importance of proper relationships within the family and within the state, the value of ritual and ceremony as expressions of social order, and the claim that good governance required rulers of genuine moral quality rather than simply effective administrators. The specific political implication of Confucian thought was that the ruler who governed by moral example would be more effective than the ruler who governed by law and punishment, because the people who were governed by moral example would internalize the values and behave well voluntarily, while those governed by law and punishment would only behave well when the law was watching. The legalist tradition was the direct counter to this Confucian argument. The legalists argued that relying on the moral quality of rulers and the voluntary virtue of the people was simply too uncertain to serve as the foundation of governance, that an effective state required institutional systems that would produce correct behavior regardless of the moral character of the individuals within it, and that the specific institutional mechanisms of clear law, consistent punishment, and systematic reward were the tools that governance actually required. The debate between these two traditions was not simply an abstract philosophical disagreement, but a practical political dispute about how states should be organized and how officials should be selected and how the population should be motivated to serve the state's goals. And the specific outcome of this debate in the Qin state, the victory of the legalist approach, had immediate and measurable consequences for how the state performed militarily and administratively. The Taoist tradition, associated with the legendary Laozi and with the slightly more historical Zhuangzi, offered a third perspective that was neither Confucian nor legalist, but that engaged with the same fundamental questions from a completely different direction. Taoism emphasized the importance of aligning with the natural order of things, of avoiding the kind of forced action that imposed human will on processes that had their own inherent direction, of governing through non-interference rather than through law or moral example. The Taoist political philosophy implied a very different kind of state from either the Confucian or the legalist version, a state that governed lightly and left space for natural processes to operate. The Mohist tradition, associated with Mozi, who lived in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, emphasized a radical form of universal love and utility, arguing that people should care equally for all other people rather than giving priority to their own family and social network as the Confucian tradition recommended, and that governance should be evaluated by its practical benefit to the greatest number rather than by its conformity to ritual or tradition. The Mohists also developed specific technical traditions in logic, optics, and military fortification that made them valuable to states, seeking practical knowledge alongside philosophical justification. The specific fate of these different philosophical traditions under the first emperor and under the Han dynasty that succeeded him is one of the threads of intellectual history that the story of the unification contains. The legalist tradition that had enabled the conquest fell with the dynasty that had implemented it most completely, not because its administrative principles were abandoned, but because the purely legalist, legitimating ideology was replaced by the Confucian framework that made unified imperial rule seem morally justified rather than simply powerful. The Taoist tradition survived and flourished in ways that were compatible with imperial governance because its political quietism was not a direct challenge to imperial authority in the way that the Confucian insistence on the moral responsibilities of rulers could be. The Taoist hermit who withdrew from political life and cultivated inner harmony was not a political threat. The Confucian official who argued that the ruler's failure to live up to moral standards justified criticism and potentially resistance was a different matter. The Mohist tradition largely disappeared after the Qin unification. Its specific combination of technical knowledge and radical egalitarianism, not finding a comfortable place in either the legalist or the Confucian frameworks that dominated subsequent Chinese intellectual life. The specific, logical, and technical achievements of the Mohist tradition were largely lost from the mainstream of Chinese intellectual development, though they have been recovered and studied by modern scholars, who find in them a tradition of analytical thinking that might have developed very differently if the intellectual competition of the Warring States period had continued. The women of the Warring States period and the early imperial period are almost entirely absent from the historical sources in ways that reflect both the patriarchal social organization of ancient Chinese civilization and the specific priorities of the literary tradition that has preserved the record. The mothers and wives and daughters of the great figures appear in the historical texts primarily as they relate to the men, whose stories the texts are primarily telling, and their own experiences and perspectives are recoverable only in fragments and through inference. Shao Ji, the mother of Qin Shi Huang, is one of the women who appears in the historical record with enough detail to give some sense of an actual person rather than simply a symbolic figure. She was born in the state of Shao, became the concubine of the merchant El Boué, was given to the hostage prince Zichu, became queen when Zichu became king, and queen mother when her son became king, navigated the complex court politics of the Regency years, and was eventually placed under house arrest by her son when her political arrangements became unacceptable to him. The specific experiences of a woman moving through all these different positions within the patriarchal political system of the period, and finding what agency she could within the constraints that system imposed, are genuinely interesting, even if the sources that preserve them are not primarily interested in her experience. The court women who appear in the texts about the first emperor's reign, the entertainers and the concubines, and the wives of officials who populated the imperial household, are even more invisible than Shaoji, reduced to their function within the patriarchal household rather than presented as individuals with their own perspectives. The specific number of women who were buried in the outer sections of the first emperor's mausoleum complex, mentioned in the ancient sources as concubines who had not borne children and who were therefore killed to accompany the emperor in death, is itself a detail that points to the human cost of the imperial institution in ways that the plebiscite administrative and military achievements tend to obscure. The servants and the workers and the lower level administrators who made the Qin administrative system actually function are another category of historical actor who is present in the physical record through the administrative documents they produced, but who is largely absent from the literary historical tradition that is primarily interested in the great figures at the top of the hierarchy, the bamboo strips with legal texts and administrative records that archaeologists have recovered from Qin and early Han period sites are the most direct physical record we have of how the system actually worked at the operational level, and they reveal a world of detailed bureaucratic procedure and systematic record-keeping that was far more complex and far more organized than the literary accounts of the period convey. The specific documents that have been recovered include case records of legal proceedings, registers of population and property, accounts of official supplies and their distribution, and various other administrative records that give the Qin system a texture and a specificity that the more general accounts in the literary sources cannot provide. The specific individuals who appear in these documents, named in connection with specific transactions or cases, are the anonymous majority of history who never entered the literary record, but who were the actual substance of the administrative achievement that the Qin state represented. The agricultural workers who formed the majority of the population of the unified Qin Empire and who produced the surplus that funded the military and the building projects and the administrative apparatus are the most invisible of all in the historical record. Their lives of seasonal agricultural labor, of paying taxes and performing military service and contributing to the corvée labor projects, are recoverable only through inference from the agricultural conditions of the period and from the administrative records that document what was extracted from them rather than what they experienced. The specific crops that the farmers of the Qin period grew, the varieties of millet and wheat and rice that had been cultivated in the different regions of China for thousands of years before the unification, were the biological foundation of everything the Qin state could do. Without the agricultural surplus, there was no military, no administration, no building projects, no philosophical schools, no Terracotta Army, nothing except the bare subsistence that the farmers extracted from the earth and consumed in staying alive. The soil of northern China that these farmers worked was the loess, the fine, wind-blown sediment that had accumulated over millions of years to create the well-distinctive yellow-brown landscape of the Yellow River Basin. It was extraordinarily productive when properly managed and irrigated, but vulnerable to erosion when the vegetative cover that held it in place was removed. The deforestation that the expansion of agriculture during the warring states period was causing was already beginning to create the erosion problems that would eventually transform the landscape and make the management of the Yellow River increasingly difficult. The specific irrigation projects that the Qin state built and managed, the canals and the water management systems that increased the productivity of the agricultural land in the Guanzhong Basin, were engineering achievements that the administrative system made possible and that the agricultural population depended on. The relationship between the state's administrative capacity and the farmer's agricultural productivity was a direct one. The state that could organize and maintain the irrigation infrastructure enabled the agricultural surplus that funded further state capacity in a virtuous cycle that the legalist reformers had understood and systematically cultivated. The animals that populated the ancient Chinese landscape in ways that are not immediately visible from the political and military history include the horses and the oxen and the dogs that were central to the agricultural and military economy. The silkworms, whose cultivation had given China one of its most valuable export commodities. The wild animals of the forests and rivers that provided protein and hides and other resources to the communities that lived near them. And the animals that appeared in Chinese religious and artistic tradition as symbols and omens. The dragons and the phoenixes and the tigers that populated the cosmological imagination of the period. The dragon that became the symbol of imperial authority in the Chinese tradition was already associated with power and with the cosmic forces that governed nature and society in the period of the first emperor. The specific way in which Qin Shi Huang deployed dragon symbolism in the representation of his own authority is part of the broader story of how the Qin dynasty created the visual and symbolic language of Chinese imperial power that subsequent dynasties inherited and elaborated. The bronze vessels and the jade objects that were the prestige goods of the ancient Chinese aristocracy were produced throughout the Warring States period, and the Qin dynasty by craftsmen working in traditions of technical mastery that had been developing since the Shang dynasty. The specific bronzes and jades recovered from Qin period sites show both the continuity of the craft tradition and the specific adaptations that the Qin aesthetic required. The ceremonial objects that accompanied the first emperor in death and the luxury goods that filled the palaces of Xianyang during his life were produced by specialists operating at the highest level of their respective traditions. The music that was performed at the Qin court and at the ceremonies of the unified empire was another dimension of the cultural life of the period that the purely political and administrative accounts overlook. The specific instruments and the specific musical traditions of the different former states were brought together in the unified court in ways that created both opportunities for synthesis and occasions for the kind of political tension cultural difference generates in contexts of conquest and absorption. The specific musical traditions that the Qin court patronized or rejected were part of the broader question of which elements of the cultures of the conquered states would be incorporated into the culture of the unified empire and which would be suppressed or marginalized. The book burning had targeted philosophical and historical texts, but the relationship between the Qin court and the artistic and musical traditions of the conquered states was more complex and more accommodating than the book-burning metaphor suggests. The architectural traditions of the different warring states, which had developed distinctive regional styles over centuries, were brought together in the palace complex at Xianyang in a specific way that the sources describe. The first emperor had the palaces of the conquered kings replicated in the Xianyang complex, bringing the architectural forms of Chu and Qi and Wei and the others into the capital as a form of symbolic incorporation. The palaces of the empire gathered into the capital city. The diversity of the Chinese architectural tradition made visible in the imperial residence. This architectural incorporation is itself a kind of historical document, evidence that the first emperor understood the unification as a gathering of the diverse into the unified, rather than simply as the imposition of one culture on the others. The specific way in which diversity was managed within the unified framework was a question that the Qin dynasty answered primarily through standardization and coercion, but that the symbolic architecture of the capital addressed in a different register, through inclusion rather than suppression. The question of whether the first emperor's project was ultimately creative or destructive, whether the costs it imposed on the people of his time were justified by the long-term benefits it created, is one that historians have debated for 2,000 years, and that will not be settled here or anywhere. It is the kind of question that depends on what values you bring to the assessment and what time frame you consider appropriate for measuring consequences. And those are questions that different people will answer differently depending on their own position in the world. and their own experience of what large-scale political projects cost. What is not debatable is that the project was real and that its consequences were real, and that the world is different because of it. The China that exists today, and the question of what China is and what its relationship to the rest of the world should be, cannot be understood without understanding the specific choices that were made in the 3rd century BC by a king who became the first emperor and who wanted to live forever, and who died at 49, and who left behind an army of terracotta warriors standing in the dark under the earth of Shanxi province. We carry all of that with us now, the weight of what was built and what was destroyed, the scale of the ambition and the scale of the cost, the specific details that make the abstract history concrete, the farmer's hand in the soil of 1974. The mercury that the surveys have detected under the burial mound, the workshop marks on the clay that identify the craftsmen by their unit rather than their name, the faces that are each individual and that are each the face of someone who lived and worked and died in the service of an ambition that was not theirs. They were there, all of them, in the specific world we have been walking through tonight. And now you have been there too, if this story stayed with you. If there were moments where you found yourself genuinely surprised by something you had not known, that is the specific pleasure this channel exists to provide. Leave a comment with the detail that surprised you most. Share this with someone who thinks they know the story of China's first emperor. Because most people know the Terracotta Army and do not know the rest. And subscribe because there are dozens more stories like this one that fell through the gaps of the history you were taught. The warriors are standing in the dark. The mound is keeping its secrets. And the idea of China that one man made is still here, still shaping the world. The specific economics of the warring states period require attention because they shaped the conditions that made unification both possible and ultimately inevitable. The 7 states were not simply political competitors, but economic competitors whose rivalry extended to control of agricultural land, mineral resources, trade routes, and the human capital represented by their populations of farmers and craftsmen and soldiers. The bronze industry that had been the foundation of military technology and aristocratic material culture, since the Shang dynasty was giving way during this period to iron technology that was cheaper to produce and more widely accessible. The specific advantage that bronze had provided to elites who controlled access to the copper and tin required to produce it was eroding as iron ore deposits, which were far more widely distributed, became the basis of weapons production. The democratization of weapons technology that iron represented was one of the forces that made the mass infantry armies of the late warring states period possible. Armies that depended on large numbers of relatively simply equipped soldiers, rather than on smaller numbers of expensive, bronze-equipped elite warriors. The agricultural innovations of the period, new tools and new techniques, and the expansion of irrigation that brought previously uncultivated land into production, were increasing the surplus that could be extracted from the farming population, and therefore increasing the resources available to the states that could organize and tax that surplus effectively. The legalist administrative reforms that Qin implemented were specifically designed to maximize the extraction of this surplus through clear taxation rules and systematic enforcement. and the comparative effectiveness of the Qin system in doing this was one of the foundations of its military superiority. The merchant class that El Bouet represented was growing in importance during the Warring States period, as the expansion of commerce within and between the states created new forms of wealth that the traditional aristocratic categories did not capture. The specific tension between the merchant wealth that El Bouet commanded and the political authority that he used it to purchase was symptomatic of a broader social transformation in which money was becoming a more important form of power than hereditary status. The legalist system was ambivalent about merchants, recognizing their economic value while being suspicious of their independence and their ability to accumulate resources outside of state control. The specific geographical advantages of the Qin state in the competition among the 7 warring states are worth tracing in detail because they illuminate why it was Qin that eventually prevailed, rather than one of the other states. The location of the Qin heartland in the Guanzhong Basin gave it several specific strategic advantages that the other states lacked. The natural defensibility that the surrounding mountains provided meant that Qin could fight on one front at a time while being relatively secure from attack from other directions. The agricultural productivity that the irrigation systems enabled meant that Qin had a reliable food surplus to fund military operations, even in years when the campaigns were long and expensive, and the specific mountain passes that controlled access to the Guanzhong Basin from the east gave Qin a choke point that could be held by small forces against large ones. The eastern states that formed coalitions against Qin during the period of expansion faced a fundamental collective action problem that the Qin strategists exploited systematically. The 7 states had different interests and different threat perceptions, and coordinating them against Qin was difficult to sustain over time. The specific diplomatic strategy associated with the Qin advisor Zhang Yi, the strategy of disrupting the coalitions against Qin by offering individual states specific deals that made defection from the coalition more attractive than maintaining it, was one of the most effective uses of political intelligence in ancient Chinese history. And it worked because the structural incentives for individual states to defect were real, regardless of the long-term consequence of allowing Qin to grow stronger. The specific advisors and strategists who served the first emperor and his predecessors as kings of Qin were themselves a remarkable group. Men who had often come from other states and who brought their knowledge of those states, weaknesses, and internal politics to serve Qin's expansionist goals. The Qin policy of welcoming talented men from other states, regardless of their origin, was itself a form of legalist meritocracy, valuing usefulness over birth, and it gave Qin access to intelligence and strategic advice about its competitors that those competitors could not easily counter. Li Si, who served as the first emperor's chief minister from the bad unification until the succession crisis following the first emperor's death, was himself from the state of Ka and had studied under the Confucian scholar Zunzi before concluding that legalism rather than Confucianism was the appropriate framework for political life. His career arc from Confucian student to legalist administrator is itself emblematic of the intellectual transformation that the Warring States period produced. The recognition that the philosophical tradition you had inherited might Li Si's eventual fate executed by the methods that Qin law applied to criminals, by being cut in half at the waist in the marketplace at Shenyang, after being implicated in the conspiracy that elevated the second emperor and then being outmaneuvered by Xiao Gao, is one of the darkest ironies of the Qin story. The man who had designed and implemented the legalist system of punishment died under it, destroyed by the specific mechanisms of court intrigue that his system had not been designed to prevent. The succession crisis that followed the first emperor's death in 210 BC is worth examining in detail because it illustrates the specific institutional failure that the Qin system contained at its core. The legalist administrative framework was extraordinarily effective at organizing state power and extracting resources from the population, but it did not solve the succession problem. The question of how power transferred from one ruler to the next was left to the specific political relationships of the court rather than to any institutional mechanism that could operate independently of those relationships. The combination of Xiao Gao's ambition, Li Si's miscalculation about where his interests lay, and the young Hai's inexperience and susceptibility to manipulation produced a succession that bypassed the natural. Aaron installed a ruler who was dependent on his advisors in ways that transferred real power from the emperor to those around him. The same legalist system that had made Qin powerful when governed by a capable and engaged ruler became a system for the abuse of power when the ruler was disengaged or incompetent. Xiao Gao's subsequent management of the second emperor illustrated this dynamic with particular clarity. He systematically eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. He prevented the second emperor from having direct contact with officials or reality. He managed the information that reached the court in ways that allowed catastrophic military failures to go unaddressed. And the story of the deer that Xiao Gao presented to the second emperor as a horse, asking those present to confirm his identification, to identify which officials would contradict him openly and which could be relied on to support his version of reality, regardless of the evidence, is one of the defining anecdotes of the period. A story about the abuse of power through the control of information that has relevance far beyond its specific historical moment. The Qin dynasty that the first emperor had built to last 10,000 generations collapsed within 15 years of the unification because it had not solved the problem that every powerful state faces: how to transfer power without destroying the capacity for governance that makes the state valuable in the first place. The succession crisis of 210 BC destroyed the administrative capacity that the Qin system had built by putting that system in the hands of people whose primary interest was personal survival and power, rather than effective governance. The Han dynasty that emerged from the chaos of the civil wars that followed the Qin collapse solved this problem imperfectly, but more successfully. The specific combination of Confucian ideology with legalist administrative practice that the Han developed created a system that had legitimating resources beyond pure coercive power, a system in which the emperor's authority was justified not just by his ability to compel obedience, but by his claimed conformity to the moral standards that the Confucian tradition articulated. These moral standards were a form of accountability that could be invoked even by officials who had no independent power base, and they created a culture of official remonstrance that periodically constrained the worst impulses of emperors in ways that the purely legalist Qin system had not. The specific legacy of the first emperor that the Han dynasty inherited and built on included not just the institutional framework, but the physical infrastructure. The roads and the canals and the walls and the administrative centers that the Qin had built during the unification and the brief period of unified rule. The Han maintained and extended this infrastructure, and in doing so maintained the practical foundation of unified governance that the Qin had created. The Great Wall that the first emperor had consolidated and extended was maintained and extended by subsequent dynasties for centuries. And the wall that tourists visit today in its most complete and most photographed form near Li, Beijing, is primarily a Ming dynasty construction, built more than 1,500 years after the first emperor's reign. But it follows roughly the same line that the Qin Wall established and serves the same defensive purpose that the first emperor intended. The specific idea of a wall along the northern frontier of Chinese civilization as the boundary between the settled agricultural world and the nomadic steppe world was an idea that the first emperor had expressed in stone and that subsequent dynasties found sufficiently compelling to maintain and reinforce the nomadic peoples to the north of the wall. The Jiannu whom the first emperor had pushed back, and the subsequent steppe confederacies that would pressure and periodically break through the wall, were the other side of the story that the wall represents. They had their own perspectives on the boundary that the wall was trying to enforce, and their own traditions of interaction with the settled civilizations to the south that were more complex than the simple raider and defender framework suggests. The specific relationship between the Chinese civilization that the first emperor unified and the steppe civilizations to its north and west is one of the long threads of world history that runs from the Warring States period through the Qin and Han dynasties, eventually to the Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century and beyond. And understanding it requires understanding both sides of the frontier that the first emperor's wall was designed to manage. The Silk Road that would eventually connect China to the Mediterranean world was in its earliest stages during the Han dynasty period, immediately following the Qin, and the specific conditions that the first emperor's unification had created: the stable administrative framework, the standardized currency and writing, the road infrastructure. All of these were preconditions for the long-distance trade that the Silk Road represented. The first emperor did not build the Silk Road, but he built the foundation on which the Han would develop it. The specific goods that Chinese civilization contributed to the world through the Silk Road trade, silk and porcelain and paper and printing and various other technologies that diffused westward through the trade networks, were products of a civilization whose continuity the Qin unification had helped to ensure. The specific knowledge and skills that produced these goods were maintained within the institutional framework of the unified Chinese state that Qin had established and that subsequent dynasties had maintained. The paper that Chinese craftsmen developed in the Han dynasty and that eventually diffused through the Silk Road to the Islamic world and from there to medieval Europe, transforming the technology of writing and record-keeping everywhere it reached, was a product of a civilization whose administrative sophistication created both the demand for writing materials and the institutional capacity to develop new ones. The Qin administrative system with its demand for written records and its legalist insistence on documentation, was one of the contexts that made the development of paper both necessary and possible. The printing technology that China developed centuries before Europe, that allowed the reproduction of texts at a scale that transformed the accessibility of knowledge, was another innovation of Chinese civilization that eventually transformed the world beyond China, and its development depended on the same administrative and intellectual context that the unified Chinese state had created and maintained. All of these connections, long and indirect and running through centuries of subsequent development, are part of the legacy of the specific choices made in the 3rd century BC by the ruler who wanted to be the first emperor and who managed to be exactly that, the first of a line that extended through 20 subsequent dynasties to 1912, the last emperor of China. The child Pui, who was enthroned at the age of 2 in 1908, and who abdicated in 1912, and whose extraordinary life was eventually told in Bernardo Bertolucci's film, used the title Huangdi, the title that Ying Zheng had created for himself in 221 BC. Through every dynasty, from Qin to Qing, the title was the same title, the one that the conference of 221 BC had assembled, and that the victorious king of Sel had claimed for himself and decreed would be used by his successors for 10,000 generations. It lasted for 2,133 years, which is not 10,000 generations, but which is a duration that exceeds most human ambitions by a considerable margin. The ambition was real, and the achievement was real, and the cost was real, and the legacy is real, and now you carry all of it. The full weight of a story that most people know only in the image of terracotta warriors and the name of a wall. You have the rest, the boy born in a hostage situation in Handan, the merchant who saw a commodity worth investing in, the king at 13 navigating a court full of people who needed him to be useful, the ruler who decided that the fragmented world of the warring states was not the world he intended to live in, the administrator who standardized the weights and the measures and the writing and the axle widths and the currency, the builder who organized hundreds of thousands of workers to build walls and roads, and the greatest mausoleum in the ancient world, the frightened man in his later years who tasted mercury in the hope of living forever and who died anyway at 49 in a carriage in Hubei, while his officials argued about who should be emperor next. He was all of these things simultaneously, as everyone always is, complicated and driven and capable and frightened and consequential. And the army he built to accompany him into death is still standing in the earth of Shanxi, still in formation, still waiting, as it has waited for more than 2,000 years. The next time someone opens the main burial chamber and finds whatever the Mercury rivers have preserved, it will be another moment like the farmer's well in 1974, another moment when the distance between then and now collapses and the past reaches through the soil with a terracotta hand and says, "We were here. We built this. Remember." If this story gave you something to carry with you, if any part of it surprised you or stayed with you or changed how you understand the world, leave a comment. Share this with someone who loves ancient history and does not yet know the full story of the man who invented China. And subscribe, because the stories we find in these places are always worth the time. The Terracotta Army is standing in the dark, and the world that one man made is still here, still turning. The specific question of how the first emperor's legacy was understood and debated within Chinese civilization over the 2 millennia after his death is itself a story worth following. Because the way a civilization remembers its most consequential figures reveals something essential about how that civilization understands itself. The Confucian historical tradition that dominated Chinese intellectual life through most of the imperial period was consistently hostile to the first emperor. The burning of books and the persecution of scholars were central charges in an indictment that emphasized his cruelty and his rejection of the values that the tradition considered foundational to good governance. Sima Qian, whose Shiji is the primary source for the history of the period, wrote in the early Han Dynasty and within a specifically Confucian framework that shaped how he selected and framed the events he recorded. His account of the first emperor is detailed and valuable, but it is not neutral. The specific passages in the Shiji that describe the first emperor are written with a literary artistry that makes them compelling reading, but that also means they are shaped by narrative purposes that go beyond simple historical record. Sima Qian was constructing a moral history in which the fall of Qin illustrated the consequences of governing through force and coercion rather than through virtue and proper ritual, and the specific incidents he chose to preserve and the way he chose to present them reflect this moral framework. Sima Qian's own life intersected with imperial power in a way that gives his historical writing a personal dimension that affects how we read his accounts of other rulers. He was castrated on the orders of the Han Emperor Wudi after he defended a general who had surrendered to the Jiannu, and he continued his historical work after this punishment specifically because he believed the history he was writing was important enough to endure the shame of continuing to live in order to complete it. A man who had experienced directly the capacity of imperial power to destroy individuals for reasons that bore uncertain relationship to justice was writing about the first emperor from a position that was anything but detached. The Tang dynasty, which ruled China from the 7th to the 10th centuries and which is one of the most celebrated periods of Chinese cultural achievement, had a complicated relationship with the Qin legacy that reflects the broader ambivalence of Chinese civilization about the first emperor. The Tang emperors maintained the unified imperial framework that Qin had established and the administrative systems that the Han had refined, but they operated within a Confucian legitimating ideology that required them to distance themselves from the specifically legalist character of the Qin approach. The Song dynasty, which followed the Temps and which is particularly celebrated for its cultural and technological achievements, including the full development of printing technology and the refinement of the examination system for selecting officials, represented the flowering of the administrative and intellectual traditions whose roots lay in the institutional framework that Qin had established. The Song examination system that selected officials based on demonstrated knowledge of the Confucian classics was the most fully developed version of the meritocratic principle that the legalist tradition had originated, translated into Confucian idiom, and made compatible with the Confucian legitimating ideology of the imperial system. The Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century, which established the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, tested the resilience of the unified Chinese imperial framework in ways that the earlier dynasties had not. A conqueror from outside the Chinese cultural tradition was now ruling the territory that Qin Shi Huang had unified. And the question of whether the institutions and the cultural identity that the unified Chinese state had developed were robust enough to survive. Governance by outsiders was answered affirmatively by the fact that the Mongol rulers found it necessary to adopt the forms of Chinese imperial governance in order to rule effectively. The Ming dynasty that overthrew the Yuan and restored Chinese rule in the 14th century was particularly conscious of the Qin legacy in its approach to governance. The Ming Great Wall, the most complete and most impressive version of the northern frontier fortification, was built by the Ming partly as a military defense and partly as a statement about the continuity of the unified Chinese state and its commitment to defending the boundary between Chinese civilization and the steppe world beyond it. The Qing dynasty that succeeded the Ming in the 17th century was itself a conquest dynasty. The Manchu people from the northeast who established the Qing, having conquered China in 1644. And the question of how a Manchu ruling house maintained authority over a predominantly Han Chinese population was one that required specific strategies of legitimation that drew on both Manchu cultural traditions and the Chinese imperial tradition that Qin had established. The Qing adoption of the Chinese imperial forms, the Confucian legitimating ideology, the examination system, the administrative framework, was both a recognition of the power of those forms and a demonstration of their resilience. The specific archaeological work that has transformed our understanding of the Qin period in the last 50 years is itself a story within the story. The discoveries of Terracotta Army pits, beginning in 1974, were the most spectacular but not the only significant archaeological findings from the period. Excavations of Qin period sites across the former Qin territory have produced bamboo strips with legal texts, bronze objects, architectural remains, and various other physical evidence that supplements and sometimes corrects the literary record. The bamboo strip legal texts that have been recovered from Qin period sites, including the extensive collection found at Shuhudi in Hubei province in 1975, give a specific and detailed picture of the Qin legal system that the literary historical sources cannot provide. The specific regulations about agriculture and about the conduct of officials and about the investigation of crimes and about the management of state assets that these texts contain are the operational reality of the legalist administrative system expressed in its actual working documents, rather than in the philosophical arguments of its theorists or the hostile characterizations of its opponents. The reading of these texts has been one of the major developments in Qin studies over the last half-century, and it has produced a picture of the Qin administrative system that is more complex and in some respects more impressive than the purely hostile literary tradition had suggested. A system of written law applied consistently across a large territory, with specific procedures for investigation and adjudication and appeal, with protections against specific forms of official abuse, and with a level of documentary detail that reflects genuine administrative sophistication rather than simply the arbitrary cruelty that the hostile tradition emphasizes. This does not contradict the evidence of the system's harshness. The punishments that the Qin legal texts specify for various offenses are severe and the system of collective responsibility that made entire family groups liable for the offenses of individual members was genuinely oppressive by the standards that most modern people would apply. But it does complicate the simple picture of Qin governance as purely arbitrary tyranny and suggests instead a specifically organized form of authoritarian governance that had its own internal logic and its own administrative coherence. The international scholarship on Qin history that has developed over the last several decades, drawing on both the Chinese archaeological and literary tradition and the perspectives of scholars from outside China, has produced a more nuanced and more complete picture of the period than was available to earlier generations of historians. The specific debates about the nature and scale of the book burning, about the degree to which Qin governance was actually as harsh as the literary sources suggest, about the specific mechanisms of the unification campaigns and the administrative integration that followed. These are live scholarly debates that the evidence currently available does not fully resolve, but that are gradually becoming more tractable as new archaeological material becomes available. The specific relationship between the academic study of Qin history and the contemporary politics of China is itself a subject that requires careful attention. The way that Chinese political culture in different periods has used the first emperor as a symbol, either of the costs of authoritarian governance or of the achievements of national unification, reflects the ongoing relevance of the questions his story raises to the specific concerns of the present. The debate about Qin Shi Huang is in part a debate about what kind of country China should be and how the relationship between the state and the individual should be organized. And these are not ancient questions, but contemporary ones. The Terracotta Army that brought the first emperor back to global attention after the discovery of 1974 has become one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. The Museum of the Terracotta Army that has been built over and around the excavation pits receives millions of visitors each year from China and from every other country. And the specific experience of standing in the viewing gallery above the main pit and looking down at the thousands of individual figures standing in formation below is one of those experiences that the word extraordinary genuinely fits without exaggeration. The individual faces that you can see from the viewing gallery, each one different from the others, each one a specific human face shaped by a specific craftsman 2,000 years ago, create a specific kind of connection between the present and the distant past that is different from the connection that reading about history creates. You are looking at the work of hands that held the clay before you were born. Hands that shaped faces that were meant to accompany the most powerful man in the world into the afterlife. And the faces are looking back at you across 23 centuries with an expression that is calm and prepared and entirely indifferent to the gap of time. They were made to last, these faces. They were made to persist in the dark and the cold and the pressure of the earth above them for as long as the earth held them. And they have lasted, they have persisted, and now they are in the light again, and the world is looking at them, and they are looking back. That is the specific quality of the encounter with the deep past that the best history creates. The sense that the distance between then and now is real and enormous, and also, in some specific way, not entirely there. That the people who lived in the worlds we study were fully human in all the ways that matter, and that their humanity reaches across the time between them and us in ways that neither the distance nor the difference fully prevents. Qin Shi Huang was fully human, frightened and ambitious and capable and cruel and driven by desires that he could not fully satisfy and shaped by experiences that he could not fully control. Just as everyone is, the specific form his humanity took was shaped by the specific world he was born into and the specific position he found himself in, and the specific consequences of his choices were shaped by the specific capacities and limitations of his time and place. But the underlying human reality is recognizable across the distance. We carry that recognition with us when we leave a story like this one. The recognition that the distance between the ancient world and the present is measured in years, but not in the fundamental qualities of human experience, and that understanding the people of the ancient world on their own terms, in their own contexts, with full attention to what they actually faced and what they actually did, is one of the most important things that history can offer. You have spent time tonight with a man who unified China, who built the Great Wall, who standardized the writing that still shapes one of the world's great civilizations, who burned books and killed scholars and searched for immortality and built an army of terracotta warriors to accompany him into death, who died at 49 and whose dynasty fell 15 years after he created it, and whose institutional legacy shaped 23 subsequent dynasties over more than 2,000 years. That is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who united China. Now yours, as much as history's. Carry it forward.